March 16, 1751, Port Conway, Virginia. In a modest plantation house along the Rappahannock River, a child was born who would architect the greatest system of government the world had ever seen. A man who would write the Constitution, champion the Bill of Rights, and design the very framework of American democracy. This is the story of James Madison, a story of intellectual brilliance and political genius, of revolutionary ideas and catastrophic failures. Of a man who stood just 5 feet 4 inches tall, but whose vision shaped a nation. His life would be marked by physical frailty and mental strength, by philosophical triumph and military disaster, by the burning of Washington and the birth of American freedom. He would create the Constitution at age 36, then watch the capital city burn at age 63. This is not just the story of a president. This is the story of the man who gave America freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the system of checks and balances that protects democracy to this day. This is the story of James Madison. Early life. James Madison Jr. was born on March 16, 1751 to James Madison Sr. and Eleanor Nellie Conway Madison at the home of his maternal grandmother in Port Conway, Virginia. He was the eldest of 12 children, though only 7 would survive to adulthood, a stark reminder of the harsh realities of 18th century life. His father was one of Virginia's wealthy planter elite, owning Montpelier, a sprawling 5,000-acre plantation in Orange County worked by over 100 enslaved people. The Madison family was prosperous and respected, though not quite as prestigious as Virginia's great dynasties like the Randolphs or the Lays. Young James was a sickly child. He was small, painfully small, and would never grow beyond 5 feet 4 inches in height or weigh more than 100 pounds. He suffered from mysterious seizures that doctors couldn't explain, likely epilepsy, though the diagnosis was never certain. He tired easily and avoided the physical activities that defined Virginia gentleman culture, riding, hunting, and managing plantation operations. His voice was soft, so soft that people standing across a room could barely hear him speak. In an age when oratory and commanding presence defined leadership, James Madison seemed destined for obscurity. But what he lacked in physical presence, he possessed in extraordinary intellectual capacity. From an early age, Madison showed a hunger for learning that set him apart. His father, recognizing his son's gifts, hired excellent tutors. Young James learned Latin, Greek, mathematics, geography, and literature. He read voraciously, devouring books on philosophy, history, and political theory. While other plantation boys learned to manage slaves and cultivate tobacco, James Madison cultivated his mind. In 1769, at age 18, Madison left Virginia for the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University. His father had chosen Princeton over the College of William and Mary in Virginia because Princeton had a reputation for healthier climate and more rigorous academics. It was a decision that would change James Madison's life and American history forever. Education and awakening at Princeton, James Madison found his intellectual home. The college president was Reverend John Witherspoon, a fiery Scottish Presbyterian minister who would later sign the Declaration of Independence. Witherspoon taught Enlightenment philosophy, Republican government theory, and the dangerous idea that people could govern themselves without kings or aristocrats. Madison absorbed everything with ferocious intensity. The typical Princeton student took 4 years to complete the curriculum. Madison finished in 2 years, studying 16 hours a day and sleeping only 4 to 5 hours a night. He ruined his health in the process, suffering from exhaustion, severe headaches, and what he feared might be early death. But he also mastered Latin, Greek, Hebrew, philosophy, theology, ethics, and law. He studied the ancient republics of Greece and Rome, reading about their rise and fall, analyzing what made governments succeed or fail. He read John Locke's theories of natural rights, Montesquieu's ideas about separation of powers, and David Hume's philosophy of human nature. Madison graduated in September 1771, but he was so exhausted and sick that he stayed at Princeton for 6 more months, studying Hebrew and philosophy with Witherspoon. He had no idea what to do with his life. Law, ministry, teaching. He was convinced he would die young and wrote morbidly to friends about his poor health and gloomy prospects. He returned to Virginia in 1772, depressed and aimless, living at Montpelier and continuing his studies in private. He seemed destined to be a scholarly recluse, living quietly on his family's plantation. Then came revolution. In 1774, Madison witnessed something that changed him forever. In Orange County, Virginia, several Baptist preachers were arrested and jailed for preaching without a license from the Anglican Church, Virginia's official state religion. Madison visited these men in jail and was outraged. Peaceful citizens, imprisoned for their religious beliefs, struck Madison as a fundamental violation of human rights. That diabolical, hell-conceived principle of persecution rages, Madison wrote to a college friend. It was the beginning of Madison's lifelong crusade for religious freedom and the separation of church and state. When the Revolutionary War began in 1775, Madison was too weak and sickly to fight. But he could think, write, and organize. In 1776, at age 25, he was elected as a delegate to the Virginia Convention, which was drafting Virginia's first state constitution. Madison was the youngest delegate and far too shy to give speeches, but his written arguments were devastating in their logic and precision. He drafted an amendment to Virginia's Declaration of Rights that changed one word but transformed history. The original draft guaranteed religious tolerance. Madison changed it to religious free exercise. Tolerance implied the government could grant or withhold religious freedom. Free exercise meant religious liberty was a natural right that government could never touch. Virginia adopted Madison's language. It was the first time in history that a government formally declared religious freedom an inalienable right. James Madison, at age 25, had won his first battle for liberty. The road to Philadelphia in 1780, at age 29, Madison became the youngest member of the Continental Congress, representing Virginia during the Revolutionary War. What he witnessed in Congress terrified him. The Continental Congress was powerless. It couldn't tax, it couldn't regulate trade between states, it couldn't enforce its own laws. It had to beg the states for money, and the states routinely ignored its requests. The national government was a pathetic joke. America wasn't really a nation. It was 13 separate countries pretending to cooperate. The Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution, had created a deliberately weak central government to prevent tyranny. Each state had one vote. 9 of 13 states had to agree to pass important legislation. All 13 had to agree to amend the Articles. It was designed to protect state sovereignty, but it guaranteed chaos. After the war ended in 1783, things got worse. States issued their own currencies, causing massive inflation. They imposed tariffs on each other's goods, strangling trade. They ignored treaties with foreign nations. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American commerce. Britain refused to evacuate forts on American soil, openly contemptuous of America's weakness. The United States was falling apart. In 1786, farmers in western Massachusetts, crushed by debt and taxes, rose in armed rebellion. Shays' rebellion sent shockwaves through the young nation. The national government couldn't stop it. Massachusetts had to suppress the rebellion on its own. George Washington wrote in despair, "What a triumph for the advocates of despotism to find that we are incapable of governing ourselves." Madison saw the existential crisis clearly. America needed a new constitution with a real national government, or the American experiment would fail within a decade. But the problem was extraordinarily difficult. How do you create a government strong enough to govern effectively, but not so strong it becomes tyrannical? How do you balance national power with state sovereignty? How do you prevent majority tyranny while preserving democratic principles? Madison became obsessed with solving these problems. For months, he locked himself away at Montpelier and studied. He read everything he could find about every government in history, ancient and modern, successful and failed. He studied the Athenian democracy, the Roman Republic, the Swiss Confederation, the Dutch Republic, the British Constitution. He read Polybius, Plutarch, Machiavelli, Locke, and Montesquieu. He filled notebooks with observations about why governments succeed or fail, what causes tyranny, what preserves liberty, how do you balance competing interests. Madison came to revolutionary conclusions that defied conventional wisdom. He determined that a large republic would be more stable than a small one, the opposite of what political theorists had believed for 2,000 years. He concluded that power must be separated among different branches of government that could check each other. He reasoned that the national government must have supremacy over states in certain spheres, enforced by federal courts. Madison wasn't just theorizing. He was designing a machine, a political machine carefully engineered to prevent tyranny while enabling effective government. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation. James Madison arrived early with a plan to throw them out and start over completely. He called it the Virginia Plan. It would become the Constitution of the United States. The Constitutional Convention on May 25, 1787, the Constitutional Convention began in the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. 55 delegates gathered behind locked doors and closed windows. Secrecy was absolute, no press, no public gallery, no leaks. They were about to attempt something never done before, deliberately design a government from scratch based on reason and philosophy rather than tradition or divine right. James Madison arrived with the Virginia Plan, a complete blueprint for an entirely new government. On May 29, Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph presented Madison's plan to the convention. The delegates were shocked. Madison wasn't proposing to revise the Articles of Confederation. He was proposing to abolish them and create a completely new government with a bicameral legislature based on population, a strong executive to enforce laws, a national judiciary to interpret laws, federal supremacy over state laws, and an intricate system of checks and balances. It was revolutionary, brilliant, and terrifying. For 4 months, from May to September 1787, the convention debated every detail. Madison attended every single session, the only delegate who never missed a day. He spoke over 200 times, more than anyone except Gouverneur Morris. And he took meticulous notes on every debate, creating the only comprehensive record of how the Constitution was created. The convention nearly collapsed multiple times. Small states like Delaware and New Jersey furiously opposed representation based on population, which would give large states overwhelming power. They demanded equal votes for each state. The deadlock nearly destroyed the convention. Roger Sherman of Connecticut finally proposed the Great Compromise, a House of Representatives based on population and a Senate with equal state representation. Madison hated the compromise. He thought it was illogical and unfair, but he accepted it to save the Constitution. The slavery question produced moral catastrophe. Southern states demanded that enslaved people count toward representation, giving slave states more congressional power, but not be taxed as property. They demanded protection for the slave trade. Northern delegates were disgusted, but felt compelled to compromise to create the Union. The result was the 3/5 compromise, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. The Constitution also prohibited Congress from banning the international slave trade until 1808 and included a fugitive slave clause requiring the return of escaped slaves. Madison owned over 100 enslaved people at Montpelier. He knew slavery was evil. He called it the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man, but he lacked the courage to fight it. He accepted slavery's protection to create the Union. It was a Faustian bargain that would lead to civil war 74 years later. On September 17, 1787, after 4 months of exhausting debate, the convention completed its work. The Committee of Style, led by Gouverneur Morris, produced the final draft. The preamble began with 3 revolutionary words: "We the people of the United States, not we the states. Not we the governments, we the people. Sovereignty rested with the people themselves." 39 delegates signed the Constitution. Benjamin Franklin, age 81, wept as he signed. George Washington signed as president of the convention. James Madison signed, knowing the document was both extraordinary and incomplete. It had no Bill of Rights protecting individual liberties. But first, it had to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. That battle would prove almost as difficult as creating the Constitution itself. The Federalist Papers, the Constitution needed approval from 9 states to take effect, but powerful opponents called anti-federalists fought bitterly against it. Patrick Henry thundered that it would create tyranny. George Mason refused to sign because it lacked a Bill of Rights. State legislatures worried about losing power. In October 1787, Alexander Hamilton recruited James Madison, and John Jay to write a series of newspaper essays defending the Constitution. They published under the pseudonym Publius in New York newspapers. Between October 1787 and August 1788, they published 85 essays that became known as the Federalist Papers. Hamilton wrote 51 essays, Madison wrote 29, Jay, who fell ill, wrote only 5. Madison's essays were masterpieces of political philosophy, still studied today as the definitive explanation of American government. In Federalist No. 10, Madison tackled the fundamental problem of democracy, factions, groups pursuing their own interests at the expense of the common good. How do you prevent a majority from oppressing a minority? How do you prevent special interests from hijacking government? Madison's answer was revolutionary: extend the sphere. Make the republic so large and diverse that no single faction can dominate. Extend the sphere and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. It was a brilliant insight that reversed 2,000 years of political theory. Claiming democracies only work in small territories. In Federalist No. 51, Madison explained the Constitution's system of checks and balances with words that became immortal. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. You can't rely on virtue to prevent tyranny. Madison argued, you must engineer a government where each branch jealously guards its power and checks the others. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. The Federalist Papers were persuasive. By July 1788, 11 states had ratified. The Constitution became law, but ratification had required promises, especially a promise to add a Bill of Rights. Madison had opposed a Bill of Rights during the convention, believing it unnecessary. Now he would have to write one, the Bill of Rights, in the 1789 election for the first U.S. House of Representatives. James Madison ran from Virginia's 5th District against James Monroe, who would later become president. The central issue was the Bill of Rights. Madison had promised Virginia's ratifying convention he would support adding constitutional amendments protecting individual rights. Monroe attacked him as insincere. Madison won, though by a closer margin than expected, and he took his promise seriously. In June 1789, Madison stood in the House of Representatives and proposed constitutional amendments to protect individual liberties. Many congressmen thought it was a waste of time. They wanted to focus on organizing the new government and addressing urgent economic issues. Madison insisted. He had studied over 200 proposed amendments submitted by state ratifying conventions. He distilled them into 17 amendments covering the most essential rights: freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches, the right to trial by jury, protection against self-incrimination. Congress debated and revised Madison's proposals through the summer of 1789. The Senate reduced 17 amendments to 12. On September 25, 1789, Congress sent 12 amendments to the states for ratification. By December 15, 1791, 10 amendments had been ratified by the required 3/4 of the states. They became the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment guaranteed freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. The Second Amendment protected the right to bear arms. The Third Amendment prohibited quartering soldiers in private homes. The Fourth Amendment protected against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment guaranteed due process, protected against self-incrimination and double jeopardy. The Sixth Amendment guaranteed the right to a speedy trial, an impartial jury, and the right to confront witnesses. The Seventh Amendment guaranteed jury trials in civil cases. The Eighth Amendment prohibited excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment declared that rights not listed in the Constitution are still protected. The Tenth Amendment reserved powers not delegated to the federal government to the states or the people. These were not legal technicalities. They were the founding principles of American liberty, the protections that make freedom real and enforceable. James Madison, at age 40, had completed his masterpiece. In just 4 years, he had designed the Constitution, defended it in the Federalist Papers, and written the Bill of Rights. He had created the architecture of American democracy. Partnership with JEFFERSON in the 1790s, American politics exploded into bitter partisan warfare. Two competing visions of America emerged. Alexander Hamilton's Federalists wanted a strong central government, a national bank, promotion of manufacturing, close ties to Britain, and loose interpretation of the Constitution to expand federal power. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's Democratic Republicans wanted limited federal power, an agrarian economy, states' rights, alliance with revolutionary France, and strict interpretation of the Constitution. Madison and Hamilton, co-authors of the Federalist Papers and allies during ratification, became bitter enemies. Hamilton called Madison a pygmy, unfit for leadership. Madison accused Hamilton of monarchical ambitions and betraying Republican principles. Madison and Jefferson formed an inseparable political partnership. They were physical opposites. Jefferson was 62, elegant and charismatic. Madison was 54, plain and reserved. But they shared a vision of an agrarian America of small farmers, limited government, and maximum individual liberty. Together, they founded the Democratic Republican Party and fought the Federalists for the soul of America. On September 15, 1794, something unexpected happened in Madison's life. At age 43, the lifelong bachelor married Dolly Payne Todd, a beautiful 26-year-old Quaker widow with a young son. Dolly was everything Madison was not: socially brilliant, charming, outgoing, and beloved by everyone. Madison was smitten. Dolly was initially hesitant. Madison was 17 years older, small, serious, and scholarly. But he courted her with quiet devotion, and she fell in love with his intelligence and kindness. Their marriage was the best decision Madison ever made. Dolly transformed her shy, scholarly husband into a social force. She hosted legendary parties, charmed political enemies, and became one of the most admired women in America. When Jefferson became president in 1801, Dolly served as unofficial First Lady since Jefferson was a widower, defining the role for all future First Ladies. James and Dolly had no biological children, but Madison adopted Dolly's son Payne Todd, a decision he would later regret as Payne became a wastrel who gambled away Madison's fortune. Secretary of State when Thomas Jefferson won the election of 1800, called the Revolution of 1800, he appointed Madison as Secretary of State. For 8 years, Madison served as Jefferson's closest advisor and architect of American foreign policy. It was a nightmare. Britain and France were locked in the Napoleonic Wars, fighting for control of Europe. Both nations violated American neutrality, seizing American ships and cargo. Britain impressed American sailors, kidnapping them at sea and forcing them into the Royal Navy. By 1807, over 6,000 American sailors had been impressed. Jefferson and Madison tried economic warfare. In 1807, they pushed through the Embargo Act, banning all American exports. The theory was that Britain and France, dependent on American trade, would be forced to respect American rights. The embargo was a catastrophic failure. It destroyed the American economy while barely affecting Britain or France. Exports collapsed, unemployment soared, New England merchants faced bankruptcy. Smuggling became rampant. The embargo was repealed in March 1809, just before Jefferson left office, having accomplished nothing except economic devastation and political humiliation. Jefferson retired to Monticello with his reputation damaged. Madison, age 57, ran for president in 1808. He won and inherited Jefferson's foreign policy disaster. The road to war. James Madison was inaugurated as the fourth president of the United States on March 4, 1809. He was 54 tall, weighed barely 100 pounds, looked frail and sickly, and spoke so softly that people in the back of rooms couldn't hear him. He looked like the least likely war president in American history, but war was coming. Britain continued seizing American ships and impressing sailors. British officers in Canada armed Native American tribes to attack American settlers on the frontier. Britain treated the United States with open contempt, viewing America as a weak, temporary nuisance. American honor was being trampled, and a generation of young, aggressive congressmen called war hawks, led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, demanded war with Britain. They promised that conquering Canada would be easy and that Britain, exhausted by war with Napoleon, couldn't fight effectively on another front. Madison tried diplomacy. Britain refused to negotiate seriously. By 1812, Madison faced an impossible choice: accept permanent humiliation and second-class status on the world stage, or fight a war America was completely unprepared for. On June 18, 1812, Madison asked Congress to declare war on Great Britain. It was the worst decision of his presidency. The War of 1812 was a disaster from the first battle. The U.S. Army had only 7,000 regular soldiers, led by elderly, incompetent generals left over from the Revolutionary War. State militias refused to fight outside their home states. The Navy had 16 ships, Britain had over 600, the Treasury was nearly bankrupt. The war hawks had promised that conquering Canada would be quick and easy. "Canada will be ours by Christmas," they declared confidently. They were catastrophically wrong. Every American invasion of Canada failed spectacularly. General William Hull surrendered Detroit to a smaller British force without firing a shot. Invasions across the Niagara River were repulsed with heavy casualties. General Henry Dearborn led his army to the Canadian border, and his militia refused to cross, claiming they couldn't be forced to fight on foreign soil. American generals proved cowardly, incompetent, or both. The only American successes came at sea. The USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, and other American warships won stunning victories in single-ship duels against British vessels, humiliating the Royal Navy and providing the only good news for Americans. By 1814, Napoleon had been defeated in Europe. Britain could now focus its full military might on America. In August 1814, a British fleet carrying 4,500 veteran soldiers sailed up Chesapeake Bay toward Washington. D.C. Madison's nightmare was about to become reality. The burning of Washington on August 24, 1814, a hastily assembled American force, mostly untrained militia, faced veteran British troops at Bladensburg, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. President Madison himself rode to the battlefield to observe, the only sitting president ever to witness combat while in office. He watched with growing horror as the battle unfolded. The American militia broke almost immediately. Soldiers fired a few shots, then threw down their weapons and ran. The battle lasted just 2 hours and became known mockingly as the Bladensburg Races, because the American militia ran away so fast. Madison himself nearly became the only president captured in battle. As British troops advanced, aides grabbed Madison and pulled him away. He fled on horseback through the Maryland countryside, sleeping that night in a farmhouse miles from the capital. The British marched into Washington unopposed. First Lady Dolly Madison became an American hero that day. While her husband fled, Dolly stayed at the White House as British troops approached. She ordered servants to pack important state papers, the original Declaration of Independence, and Gilbert Stuart's iconic portrait of George Washington, the same portrait that hangs in the White House today. "Our kind friend, Mr. Carroll has come to hasten my departure," Dolly wrote in a letter as cannons boomed in the distance, "and is in a very bad humor with me. Because I insist on waiting until the large picture of General Washington is secured." The portrait was screwed to the wall. Dolly ordered the frame broken and the canvas cut out and saved. Only when British soldiers were blocks away did she finally escape in a carriage. That night, British soldiers ate the dinner that had been prepared for President Madison, drank his wine, and mocked the absent president. Then they set fire to the White House. They burned the Capitol building, the Treasury, the War Department, the Library of Congress with all its books. Every government building except the Patent Office, which a British officer spared, calling it useful to all mankind. Washington burned through the night, flames visible for miles. America's capital was destroyed. It was the greatest military humiliation in American history, and James Madison, the father of the Constitution, was responsible. Redemption: the burning of Washington shocked and humiliated America. Newspapers called for Madison's resignation. Critics called him the worst president in American history. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war, gained strength. But the British attack also did something unexpected. It united Americans in furious determination. After burning Washington, the British moved on Baltimore, but Baltimore was ready. Volunteers rushed to defend Fort McHenry, which guarded Baltimore Harbor. When the British attacked on September 1814, the fort's defenders held firm through 25 hours of continuous bombardment. Francis Scott Key, a lawyer detained on a British ship, watched the bombardment through the night, unable to see through the smoke whether the fort had fallen. At dawn, he saw the American flag, tattered but still flying over Fort McHenry. Overcome with emotion, he wrote a poem on the back of a letter, "The Star-Spangled Banner." The British attack on Baltimore failed, the invasion was stopped. In December 1814, American and British diplomats meeting in Ghent, Belgium, negotiated a peace treaty. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814, ended the war. It resolved almost nothing. No territory changed hands, no maritime rights were settled, no impressment issue was decided. It was essentially a return to the status quo before the war. But news of the treaty traveled slowly across the Atlantic. Before it reached America, one final battle would transform the war's legacy. On January 8, 1815, a massive British invasion force attacked New Orleans, attempting to capture the Mississippi River and split the United States. Defending the city was General Andrew Jackson with a ragtag army of regulars, militia, pirates, and free black soldiers. Jackson's forces were entrenched behind fortifications. When the British attacked in traditional formation, American riflemen and artillery decimated them. In just 30 minutes, over 2,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, including 3 generals. American casualties, 71. It was the most lopsided victory in American military history. Ironically, the battle was fought 2 weeks after the peace treaty was signed, but news hadn't reached America. When Americans learned of Jackson's overwhelming victory at New Orleans, national euphoria erupted. Suddenly, the war that had been a humiliating disaster became the Second War of Independence. Americans convinced themselves they had defeated the British Empire. Madison's reputation transformed overnight. The president who had lost Washington became the president who had defended American sovereignty. The Federalist Party, tainted by its opposition to the war, collapsed and soon disappeared entirely. Madison's final 2 years in office were surprisingly successful. He supported chartering the Second Bank of the United States, reversing his earlier constitutional opposition. He supported federal funding for roads and infrastructure. He strengthened the military. On March 4, 1817, James Madison retired from the presidency at age 65, surprisingly popular despite the war's disasters. He and Dolly returned to Montpelier, Madison's Virginia plantation, to live out their remaining years. Madison thought he would finally have peace. He was wrong. Final years James Madison's final 19 years were marked by intellectual engagement, personal heartbreak, and financial ruin. He remained deeply involved in public affairs. He corresponded with Jefferson, John Adams, and younger politicians. He advised Monroe's administration. When Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, Madison became rector of the University of Virginia, overseeing the institution his friend had founded. Madison also carefully prepared his notes on the Constitutional Convention for eventual publication. He meticulously edited them, knowing they would be his greatest legacy, the only comprehensive record of how the Constitution was created. He refused to publish them during his lifetime, waiting for all the other framers to die first so he could speak freely without causing offense. But Madison's personal life was marked by tragedy. His stepson, Payne Todd, Dolly's son from her first marriage, was a charming, handsome wastrel. He drank heavily, gambled compulsively, and ran up enormous debts. Madison paid Payne's debts over and over to protect Dolly from shame and heartbreak. It bankrupted him. Payne also stole from Madison, taking valuable items from Montpelier and selling them to pay gambling debts. Madison knew but said nothing, unwilling to break Dolly's heart. Madison's plantation was also failing economically. Tobacco prices collapsed. Poor management and Payne's theft drained resources. By the 1830s, Madison was drowning in debt. He sold land. He sold enslaved people to other plantations, tearing families apart. He considered selling Montpelier itself. Madison also struggled with the question of slavery. He had owned enslaved people his entire life, inheriting them from his father, buying more, running Montpelier using enslaved labor. By the 1830s, he owned over 100 human beings. Madison knew slavery was evil. He had said so repeatedly throughout his life, calling it the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. but he lacked the courage to free them. In 1829, Virginia held a constitutional convention. Madison, aged 78 and in failing health, attended as a delegate. He proposed gradual emancipation combined with colonization, sending freed slaves to Africa. He argued this would end slavery without threatening white society or property rights. The proposal went nowhere. Younger Virginians like John C. Calhoun were now defending slavery as a positive good, not an evil to be gradually eliminated. Madison was horrified but powerless. And in his own will, he freed exactly 0 enslaved people, except granting Dolly permission to free his personal servant if she chose. George Washington had freed all his slaves upon his death. Thomas Jefferson freed a handful, James Madison freed none. His wealth, his comfort, his entire life had been built on slavery, and he chose property over principle until the very end. In 1836, Congress agreed to purchase Madison's Constitutional Convention notes for $30,000, desperately needed money, but it was too late to save his finances. By June 1836, James Madison was dying. He was 85 years old, bedridden, unable to eat solid food, drifting in and out of consciousness. On the morning of June 28, 1836, Madison's enslaved servant Paul Jennings brought him breakfast. Madison tried to eat but couldn't swallow. "What is the matter, Uncle James?" Jennings asked. Madison replied softly, "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear." His head dropped forward. He was dead. James Madison died peacefully at Montpelier on June 28, 1836. He was 85 years old, the last surviving framer of the Constitution. His death marked the end of the founding generation. Legacy James Madison's funeral was simple, attended by family, neighbors, and some of the enslaved people he had owned. He was buried at Montpelier near his parents. His death triggered financial catastrophe for Dolly. Madison's estate was bankrupt. She was forced to sell Montpelier and most of the enslaved people to pay debts. Families were torn apart at auction, sold to plantations across the South. Dolly moved to Washington, D.C., where she lived on charity and the proceeds from selling Madison's papers. She remained beloved by Washington society until her death in 1849. Paul Jennings, the enslaved man who had served Madison for decades, was eventually purchased and freed by Senator Daniel Webster. Jennings later wrote A Colored Man's Reminiscences of James Madison, the first memoir by a White House servant. The enslaved people of Montpelier, the invisible laborers whose work had built Madison's world, were scattered, sold, and forgotten by history for over a century. James Madison's legacy is as complicated as the man himself. He was the father of the Constitution, architect of the most successful democratic system of government in human history. His Constitution has survived civil war, world wars, depressions, and social upheavals for over 235 years, the oldest written national constitution still in use on Earth. He wrote the Bill of Rights, the 10 amendments that protect American freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches, the right to trial by jury. These weren't just legal technicalities, they were and remain the founding principles of American liberty. He wrote the Federalist Papers, especially Federalist No. 10 and No. 51, which remain foundational texts of political philosophy studied around the world. He established separation of church and state as a core American principle, ensuring religious freedom for all. He designed the system of checks and balances that prevents any branch of government from dominating the others, protecting democracy from tyranny. But Madison also failed catastrophically. His handling of the War of 1812 nearly destroyed the nation and led to the burning of Washington. His military incompetence and poor choice of generals cost thousands of American lives. Most damningly, he owned over 100 enslaved people throughout his life and freed none in his will. He knew slavery was evil but lacked the moral courage to act on that knowledge. He built his personal wealth and comfort on the forced labor of human beings, and he died leaving those human beings to be sold at auction like livestock. Madison's Constitution protected slavery for 74 years until Civil War and the 13th Amendment finally ended it. The compromises Madison accepted to create the Union, the 3/5 Clause, protection of the slave trade, the Fugitive Slave Clause, were built on a foundation of moral rot. James Madison was a genius who created a government designed to outlast its creator's flaws. but he couldn't transcend his own flaws. He built a system based on liberty while enslaving human beings. He designed protections against tyranny while denying basic rights to those he owned. Every time an American exercises freedom of speech, practices their religion freely, refuses unreasonable searches, or demands due process under law, they live inside James Madison's creation. But when we confront America's original sin of slavery and its lasting legacy of racial injustice, we also stand in Madison's shadow, a reminder that even the most brilliant minds can rationalize evil. And that genius doesn't equal virtue. James Madison was 5 feet 4 inches tall, but his ideas were giants. His failures were too. This is the legacy of James Madison, the man who gave America the architecture of freedom, but lacked the courage to extend that freedom to everyone. The genius who changed the world, and the flawed human being who reminds us that even our greatest heroes are only human. This is why he belongs to the ages, not as a perfect hero, but as a complicated man whose brilliance and failures both shaped the American experiment. This is the story of James Madison.